And among those were 7 others, including Hayek, who were regarded as renegades for 30-odd years, but 8 of them out of that 36 went on to receive Nobel Prizes in economics, which is a remarkable achievement for a small society. And essentially they built up neoliberalism. And I think it's vitally important for the analysis, and this is a key point I make in this book and have done earlier, is not to regard this period as a period of deregulation. Again, another one, if anybody uses that term, I would advise them to take up gardening rather than remain in social science. Chris said I have strong opinions, well, so I'm trying to prove him correct. Because deregulation, I worked in that period in the International Labour Organization. And I can say without fear of contradiction that more new labour regulations were introduced in this period than at any comparable period in history. What it was a change in the type of regulations. Now clearly, we've seen a period of labour ecommodification around the world where there's been a shift back to payment for labour to money wages. So you've had a whittling away of enterprise benefits, a whittling away of access to state benefits around the world, so that it's quite distorting to look at what's happened to wages and interpret those as either an improvement or a static standard of living if there's been a loss of a lot of those other forms of benefits. And of course you've seen the full debate on labour flexibility. I wrote my first, shame on me, I wrote my first article on labour flexibility and insecurity in 1982. And when it was published in the International Labour Review, I remember all the industrial relations people saying, Guy, this subject's going to go away in a couple of years. You know, but it'll move on, it'll be all forgotten. That was 1982. And of course, flexibility has been one of the sexy subjects of the last 30-odd years. Now you've seen a shift away from labour-based social security much more to a residual model, but not a residual in the sense that Josta Espin Andersen meant, because it's actually involved quite a lot of workfare element and jobfare state element, but I'll come back to that perhaps a little later. Now, what is key to this understanding of what has been happening to the global labour market and the global labour process is that the regulatory instruments have been systematically dismantling the barriers to commodification. There's a chapter here, which I will not go through, you'll be glad to know, going through the various institutions that were giving protection to people, including the family, and how various aspects of the family have been commodified. Lovely new concepts which have crept into the debate, like emotional labour and things like that. So you'll get all sorts of funny things developing. The education system, I hardly need tell you, has been subject to commodification in a terrifying way. So the shifted to preparing people to be employable and developing their human capital. So the complete opposite of what a liberating education system was intended to be. You've also seen, obviously, a withering of collective bargaining, a privatization of things like arbitration, and Kathy has done some fantastic work on that area. And labour regulations have been reformed systematically to be anti-collective in their emphasis. And you've had the shift to contractualization. And I think it's very interesting in this respect to see what's been happening in China, because the China 1994 labour law and the 2008 labour contract law really sets out what is happening outside the United States and outside Europe, which is where many of these developments are taking place. Now, most critically, and where I feel the economics profession, me included, all of us, have been remiss, is that there has been a systematic dismantling of occupational communities. And this is the key part of the book, because basically occupations, for better or for worse, we're all distracted slightly. Occupations, for better or worse, over the centuries, had been barriers to commodifying pressures in the labour market. Labour economists have done remarkably little work on occupational labour markets. You pick up a textbook. I was teasing Chris, I was in his office before this, so I went through the few books that he had, the few of his books that he had in that, and I looked up the indexes. None of them had anything on occupations. Remarkable. And these are mainstream books, and it's often the case. Many of us have been remiss. Now, I think it's very interesting that in the period of globalization, you can trace how different occupations lost control over different aspects of their sphere of competence. And it's quite interesting to see how they've lost control of their market in many respects. Again, this may be good or this may be bad, but you can see that this has been happening. The classic case where the loss of control of the market, which I find extraordinary, is that you see it with some of the low-level occupations. But they got the big ones in Britain in 2007. This is a Labour government, a supposedly pro-worker government, where they basically, with the 2007 Legal Services Act, shattered the bar. Now that is a major achievement. This is the pinnacle profession, the rest of it. And what they did is they set out that henceforth people practicing law were to provide legal services, commercialized, competitive legal services. And anyone who's interested, it's been nicknamed the Tesco Law. And the Tesco is a supermarket chain where they're now planning to supply legal services in the supermarket. So you can go along and press a whole lot of buttons and you will be able to buy the customized, standardized legal service that you want. You want a will, you want a divorce, you can go and buy it in Tesco's. Now, the interesting thing is that they set up a legal services board, which came into full effect last month. And the legal services board is chaired by a non-lawyer. So henceforth you transfer control from the occupation to an external. And the mandate of the board is that practices are only acceptable if they conform with the market. If they don't conform with the market, then they must be blocked. The same with the medical professions. You've seen this in this country, you've seen it in the UK, you've seen it in Europe. And it was particularly significant when the US Federal Trade Commission rescinded exemption of professions from antitrust, which was a particularly interesting development. Now you can see how occupations have lost control over their income, determining what incomes that they can get. They've lost control over their labor power, how many people can be induced to practice. They've lost control over the skill, the knowledge. More and more around the world, what's accepted as knowledge is transferred to an external body rather than the internal. And you can see lost control over time, and most critically, they've lost self-control over the ethics of a profession, which was one of the great features, one of the positive features, and I don't want to romanticize, of the old occupational guilds that have stretched back through history. Now, in the process, and I've got a long chapter on this, so please excuse me, but I won't go through it again. A long, boring chapter. You've had a battle about occupational regulation. It's a battle between self-regulation and state regulation. And guess which has been winning? Clearly, the old self-regulation model that you can trace back to Babylon and so on had certain advantages and had certain disadvantages, which I won't go through, but it had been honed over the centuries and was the main form of regulation. Now, what has happened in the period of globalization is systematically, and you can document it around the world, there's been a transfer from self-regulation to state regulation. And it's been done primarily through licensing.